Trust's a tough thing to come by these days.
What is it that makes a horror film scary? It's not the gore, because we know it's not real. It's not the monsters, because we know it's either a costume, a puppet, or CGI. And it's not the jump scares. What makes the best horror movies scary is how they explore the unknown. Why the hell is this masked man in a jumpsuit murdering people? Why isn't he saying anything? Why does he love fresh linens? None of it makes any sense, and because we can't make sense of it, it's unsettling. Add the threat of violence to something unsettling, and all of a sudden, you've got horror. Halloween is a great example of this. But today we're going to look at another John Carpenter classic to show how he effectively turned some of the greatest fears of the early 80s into one of the most memorable horror films of all time. Before we do, take a look at his inspiration. One of John Carpenter's favorite films is Howard Hawks' 1951 movie, The Thing from Another World. It's regarded as one of the greatest sci-fi movies of the 50s, and you can still see its influence today.
Come in. Close the door.
Shut that door, there's a goddamn blizzard out there!
Close the door! Come in. Close the door!
Close the door! The goddamn It's already cold enough in here!
In fact, Tarantino was so inspired by it that his Hateful Eight was practically a remake. Just like The Thing, The Hateful Eight is about a group of people stranded during a snowstorm. Nobody trusts anybody?
One of them fellas is not what he says he is.
And at least one of them is secretly killing people. Tarantino even repurposed several unused orchestral tracks that Ennio Morricone had originally written for John Carpenter's remake of The Thing. Just listen to how the sci-fi horror soundtrack sets an ominous tone in what would otherwise be a beautiful landscape shot. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before signing on to direct The Thing, Hawks had already made Scarface, His Girl Friday, and a few other classics. So him joining the project brought a bit of gravitas to the production. Hawks was known for getting realistic performances and dialogue from his actors, which is something you just didn't see in sci-fi movies at the time. It's a pretty loose adaptation of John W. Campbell's novella, Who Goes There?, which came about 10 years earlier. It's just a 39-page story, but the writers of both Alien and The Invasion of the Body Snatchers cited the novella as a major inspiration for them, so if it wasn't for Campbell's story, some of the best sci-fi films would have never been made. The movie follows most of the plot points from the book. It opens with a reporter tagging along with some American soldiers to investigate an aircraft that crashed in the ice. It turns out to be a flying saucer, but they accidentally blow it up while trying to unbury it. One of them finds an alien frozen in the ice nearby, and they all rush over to examine it.
What is it? Looks like a man.
They cut the alien out of the ice and bring it back to their outpost. The ice thaws, the thing breaks out.
Where's the captain? I've got to tell him that thing's alive.
And he gets fucked up by a pack of sled dogs. And shortly after, the crew's doctor examines a piece of the thing the dogs tore off. This is where the book and the movie part ways. Instead of the alien being a three-eyed, tentacled, shape-shifting monster that absorbs anything it comes in contact with, the alien in the movie is something entirely different.
Sounds like you're trying to describe a vegetable. I am.
And it ends up just being Frankenstein. Compared to later adaptations, this thing looks pretty uninspired and isn't found anywhere in the source material. The reason for that is probably that the technology to make a big shape-shifting alien just didn't exist in 1951, and that making the alien a big Russian caricature really drove the point home for audiences. The movie turns into a full-blown war propaganda film by the end, which had become incredibly popular among big studio pictures in the 50s. The plot centers around a conflict between Captain Hendry and Dr. Carrington, with Carrington arguing that they should try and learn from the the alien, and Captain Hendry insisting that they should just burn the godless monster.
With gasoline!
In case audiences had any doubt about which one of them was right, we get this scene where Carrington's appeal to reason lethally fails.
I'm not your enemy, I'm a scientist. I'm a scientist who's trying.
The movie reflects the Cold War paranoia that had begun to spread through America at the time, and that's clear nowhere more than in the closing lines.
Watch the skies, everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies.
Keep an eye out for communists, folks. When we look back on it now, 70 years later, it looks like another cheesy sci-fi movie about an alien invader trying to kill people. But it's literally the first one. All of those other alien movies that seem like copies of each other are really just copying this one. Hawks' movie isn't just another creature feature. The creature doesn't even show up until halfway through the movie because Hawks was more interested in developing the character dynamics at the outpost than the spectacle. A talented and established director took a pretty routine sci-fi script and elevated it into a movie that would endure for decades. So, when Universal acquired the rights 30 years later and asked John Carpenter to direct it, he was overwhelmed with responsibility. Not only was he being asked to remake his favorite movie by his favorite director, he was also being asked to remake a movie that had sparked an entire new genre of sci-fi. Instead of trying to improve on the movie Carpenter loved as a kid, which he thought would be impossible, he chose to stay much more true to the source material and adapt that instead. He decided that the right thing to do was make it reflect the paranoia of the 80s the same way Hawk's movie reflected the paranoia of the 50s.
Nobody trusts anybody now. We're all very tired.
In both eras, people were nervous about the ever-present threat of the invisible communist. But the big new scare of the 80s was AIDS. It took a long time for some basic questions about AIDS to get answered, so throughout the 80s most people just knew two things about it. People with AIDS are keeping a secret, and their blood can kill you. Some of the first people Carpenter enlisted on the project were Kurt Russell, who he just worked with on Escape from New York,
You're Snake Plissken, ain't you?
and his regular cinematographer Dean Cundey, who would go on to shoot masterpieces like Jurassic Park, Back to the Future, and Jack and Jill. Then came time to design the creature. Carpenter was impressed with the werewolf transformation effects that Rob Bottin had designed for the 1981 cult classic The Howling, and he'd been introduced to him by Dean Cundey a year earlier while they were both working on The Fog. Doing creature work on something like The Thing was a dream project for the 22-year-old kid, and he jumped on the project immediately. Bottin had the idea that the creature should be this constantly shifting form that was an amalgamation of all the creatures on all the planets it absorbed. Carpenter thought it was a great idea and sent Bottin to go work with their storyboard artist Mike Ploog to design each creature appearance scene by scene. Bottin worked 7 days a week for over a year creating and overseeing every creature design in the movie with the exception of the dog monster, which he'd stretched himself too thin to work on. So that was left in the very capable hands of Stan Winston. Bottin worked incredibly hard on all the creature effects, and usually slept on set in order to save time going to and from the studio. At the end of production, he looked like hell, and Carpenter insisted that he get himself checked into a hospital where he learned he'd come down with double pneumonia and a bleeding ulcer.
I think you should take the rest of the day off.
In Carpenter's version of The Thing, we skip the discovery of the crashed spaceship and instead start with a dog being chased through the ice by a man with a gun in a helicopter. It immediately grabs your attention. Then we meet MacReady, who's far from leadership material.
Cheating bitch.
The dog makes it to Outpost 31, and the Norwegian gets shot in the head after he misses, and it hits Bennings in the leg. Rest in peace, Lars. MacReady's pissed off and gears up to fly over to the Norwegian camp to get some answers. And then there's that hat.
Every night in my dreams, I see you, I feel you.
When he arrives at the Norwegian camp, there's nothing left but burning buildings and corpses. Around this time, the dog from the beginning erupts into a nasty alien and starts absorbing the other dogs. Then the crew runs in and lights it up with a flamethrower. What follows is one of the nastiest autopsy scenes in cinema history. That's when the gravity of the situation sets in. Everything is simpler on a cellular level. Blair realizes this thing could imitate anyone, and he doesn't know who's human anymore. That paranoia pretty quickly spreads throughout the camp, and some people start losing their shit.
Okay, Blair. Come on, man. You don't want to hurt anybody.
I'll kill you!
The last half hour of the movie is when Bottin's creature effects really take center stage. The most iconic scene in the movie is entirely thanks to him.
Clear!
Blair?
When the cast of the 12 Angry Men are reduced to just 6, MacReady decides to cut the bullshit and tie everyone to a couch to test their blood for signs of infection. It was a good idea, but it turns out Palmer was an alien and Windows doesn't act well under pressure. MacReady burns Windows before he can change into a creature and quickly takes care of the Palmer thing. Jesus. The remaining crew go back to check on Blair, who they've quarantined after his freakout, and discover he's tunneled underground and started building a spaceship. Childs and Null disappear, and Gary gets killed, which leaves MacReady on his own for the final fight, which is just him throwing more dynamite.
Yeah, fuck you too!
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Childs finds MacReady while he's stumbling around outside. They agree that if one of them is the Thing, there's not much either of them can do about it, so they'll just wait and see what happens. That uncertainty is the power of the Thing. Normally in a horror film, when the whole cast is together in one room, you can rest easy. But in the Thing, no one is ever safe. The monster may be standing right beside you. Carpenter has said the Thing may represent the fear of communism or the fear of AIDS, but there isn't one single fear that it represents. It's whatever you, the viewer, are afraid of. Whether it be an untrustworthy person, a privately violent friend, or any stressed out stranger. Because all of those fears are deeply tied to the human experience, the terror of the thing is timeless. Nearly 3 decades after John Carpenter's masterpiece was made, and fresh off producing Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead remake, Eric Newman and Mark Abraham were looking through Universal's catalog to see what other classic properties they could remake. Both of them were huge fans of Carpenter's movie, and felt the only way to revisit it would be to tell the story of the Norwegian camp that was found already destroyed at the beginning of the movie. Unfortunately, Carpenter was never contacted about the prequels, so he didn't have any input on the production. He said when he was signed on to make the 1982 movie, it was as a hired gun. He was working for a big studio, and it just happened to be a property that he cared about immensely. In a 2011 interview, Carpenter said that he hadn't seen the prequel, but that they've, quote, got a babe with a flamethrower, so it must be good. In any case, Universal liked the producer's pitch and pre-production started right away. Eric Heiserer, who was fresh off writing the Nightmare on Elm Street reboot and would go on to write 2016's Arrival, signed on to write the script. He wanted to make a movie that followed all the conventions of Carpenter's movie without it feeling like a remake. He was given a few parameters to follow, but the most influential note from the studio was that the movie needed a female protagonist. There were a few previous attempts at a script that all included a male protagonist, but the studio didn't think any of them were good enough to avoid unfair comparison to Kurt Russell's MacReady. And they were right. In Heiserer's original script, the movie opens with Mary Elizabeth Winstead's character Kate being told that some Swedes led by Sander Halvorson have made an unprecedented discovery in Antarctica and that someone with her skills is needed right away. She agrees, and they fly her down later that day. Sander introduces Kate to the rest of the team, and she gets to know them a little bit. They've each got traits that make them relatable and stand out from one another. Notably, Lars is kind of a klutz. He doesn't speak any English, he's always dropping things, and it's pretty obvious that he's going to be the first one to die. After introduction, Sander takes Kate to the massive crater they found in the ice. What do they see down there? Well, it's gotta be some sort of crashed mystery vessel. There's no way to get inside the ship yet, so Sander takes Kate to see what it is she came here for. The alien, which they suspect exited the ship to try to find someplace warm to hide. She directs them on how to cut the thing out of the ice, and they bring it back to camp. At some point during all of this, Heiserizer sets up a great bit of foreshadowing with a scene that has someone explain to Kate that if you cry out in the ice, the wind chill will cause your tears to freeze over your eyes, and that'll be the last thing you see before you die. Back at the camp, which is a perfect recreation of the camp from John Carpenter's movie using Kurt Russell's height as a measuring device, the team celebrates their find. During all of this, the thing thaws, breaks out of the ice, and kills a guy. After that, the movie follows a lot of beats from the Carpenter movie for the next 40 minutes, with a couple key differences. First, the paranoia that spreads throughout the camp is much more xenophobic than it is individual.
How could this happen? Well, it was no accident. He's got something to hide. What, are you an asshole?
And secondly, the thing is much less afraid to show itself. These differences make a lot of sense for the story. The alien's experience at the Norwegian camp taught it that it needs to be a lot sneakier to survive around humans, so we don't see it screaming down the hallways in Carpenter's movie. And in the prequel, we've got two distinct cultures, which creates a natural divide when shit hits the fan. Heiserer's script ended with Kate and the other surviving American, Carter, chasing after Sander and a snowcat, discovering a collection of dead alien species on board the spaceship, and killing the thing just before it can pilot the ship off-world in the form of the alien species that crash-landed. Kate and Carter run outside where their plan is to use the last of the fuel to try and make it to another outpost. But Kate notices that Carter's earring has swapped ears, and that's enough evidence for her to get suspicious and torch him. Carter burns alive, and we never get any clues as to whether or not she was right. The snowcat burns with Carter, Kate's completely out of fuel, and she's stranded in a blizzard. She walks off into the snow with sub-zero winds hitting her face, and she begins to cry. Fade to black.
Oh, that's brutal.
But that's not the movie we got. Test audiences thought it was slow and confusing, and that the creature effects didn't look real. You know, like John Carpenter's classic. Instead of standing by their director's original vision, the studio insisted on reshoots. The movie was recut to move the action a lot closer to the beginning, and practically all of the character development for the Norwegians was cut up to tighten up the runtime. Test audiences didn't understand where the three-eyed alien at the end came from, so a new scene was added with a big CGI monster wearing Sander's face so people could go, "Oh, I remember him. I think the alien with teeth for eyes is supposed to be the bad guy." The CGI effects that were added in post changed the movie in a lot of ways. From the outset, they wanted the prequel to play as a perfect double feature with Carpenter's movie. And to do that, they needed the practical effects to blend in seamlessly with what Rob Bottin created. and they did an awesome job. Amalgamated Dynamics was brought on to do the creature effects for the movie, and they created a ton of beautiful models and full-scale creature designs to be used throughout. They pulled off the same aesthetic from Boutine's monster, and mixed in a handful of their own original monsters that fit perfectly in the established design. From the awesome Griggs thing on the helicopter, to the Juliet thing splitting open backwards, their effects would have been awesome to see in the movie. Unfortunately, the director and studio weren't satisfied with the end result, saying he knew the practical effects were important to some people, but at the end of the day, it looked like an 80s movie. Which seems like what you'd want from a movie that's supposed to play seamlessly back-to-back with a movie from 1982, but what do I know? He goes on to say that they enhanced it with CGI, which delayed the release of the movie by about 6 months. He said in an interview that the ratio of practical effects to CGI in the movie was about 70-30, but that's just not true. This is like when they replaced Yoda with CGI. It'd be one thing if CGI was their only option, but they'd already shot it with awesome puppetry and then retroactively made it worse by replacing the character with animation that takes us out of the movie. The 1980s equivalent of CGI was stop motion. And though we do get this one tiny shot of stop motion in Carpenter's film, they'd originally shot a whole stop motion sequence for the film. Ultimately, Carpenter decided that his eye could still detect that it wasn't real, and he chose to cut most of it from the film. Despite the deleted scenes and the CGI cover-ups, the prequel still works well as a companion piece to Carpenter's classic, and I can never watch one without the other. CGI or not, the creature design is still great. Mary Elizabeth Winstead turns in a great performance, and the filmmaker's attention to detail shows how, at least at one point, they truly cared about recreating the magic of the 1982 film. There are obvious examples of this, like their post-credit scene that drops us off in the opening shots of Carpenter's movie, or this shot of Colin with his wrist cut at the end, but there are plenty of other examples that were so satisfying to notice.
Don't touch it. Carlotta. What is that? It's like they're transforming into
They're imitating his cells.
There is hope for another adaptation on the horizon, and maybe this time the studios will let their filmmakers produce the movie they pitch. In 2018, a copy of John Campbell's original short story was discovered by a biographer, except it was titled Frozen Hell, and it had an extra never-before-seen 40 pages. Whether or not those 40 pages is cause for excitement is besides the point, because the discovery was enough to renew interest in the property, and in January 2020, Universal signed with Blumhouse to make a reboot. Universal has an obscene amount of money, and Blumhouse famously lets indie horror directors make whatever they want, so there's reason to be optimistic about this adaptation. As of this video, no details have been released, and all we've heard from Carpenter is that he may be involved somewhere down the line. The fact that this film series is 70 years old and fans are still getting excited about new installments is a testament to the staying power of the original story and the persistence of the fear of paranoia. We've seen 3 different versions of the story now, and some may say that's enough. But as long as mankind continues to distrust one another, there will always be another thing.
Lice feed on a person's blood, and just like mosquitoes, they leave behind small traces of their saliva in the host's bloodstream. That saliva is monochromagnetic. So if an infected person's blood is touched by this hot metal coil, say, that person's blood will jump 10 meters into the air.
That's retarded! You didn't come up with that experiment, Cartman. You saw it in that movie, The Thing.
This is a scientific test designed to...
You saw it in The Thing, and you're wasting everyone's time!
We'll start with what I already know.
Well, guess that proves Eric wasn't the one with head lice. It doesn't prove anything.